Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and thanks for tuning in. We're continuing our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson, and specifically the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, these papal decrees that form the basis and the substance of Roman Catholic canon law, and its emphasis on the supreme, global, infallible, and unquestioning power of the Pope, the divine right to rule the world as a world sovereign. Now, you might imagine that when the papacy created this pretension, that it had to be implemented in the world to be effective, and that implementation came gradually and slowly with many setbacks, but progress has been made all throughout history. And we're going to continue now by backing up just a few paragraphs for continuity this morning. Speaking of the end game of the papacy, the end sought for was only reached. Now let me stop and tell my listeners we're on the first full paragraph on page 398. The first full paragraph on page 398, near the middle of the page. But the end sought for was only reached by slow degrees and by gradual usurpations. It took many years of severe struggle on the part of the popes to consummate it by the abolition of the old and the introduction of the new ecclesiastical system founded upon the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals. It requires the combined intellect, courage, and unbending will of the three popes, the three great popes, or rather not great, but powerful popes, Gregory VII, Alexander III, and Innocent III, to do what all the other popes were unable to accomplish. That is, to elevate the papacy above all the nations and place emperors and kings at their feet. The author of The Pope and the Council, a book that deserves careful study, not merely because of the great ability it displays, but because it is written by a Roman Catholic, though opposed to papal infallibility, thus speaks of the times following immediately after the pontificates of Nicholas I, Adrian II, and John VIII. Here's what it says. Quote, "Nearly 3 centuries passed before the seed sown produced its full harvest. For almost 200 years, from the death of Nicholas I to the time of Pope Leo IX, the Roman See was in a condition which did not allow of any systematic acquisition and enforcement of new or extended rights. For about 60 years, from the period 883 A.D. to 955 A.D., the Roman Church was enslaved and degraded, while the Apostolic See, that is the papacy, became the prey and the plaything of rival factions of nobles, and for a long time of ambitious and profligate women. It was only renovated for a brief interval between 997 and 1003 A.D. in the persons of Gregory V and Sylvester II by the influence of the Saxon emperor." Now, you must understand that having acquired to itself, through these forged documents, the divine right to rule the world, you can easily imagine how the papacy, the so-called chair of Peter, became the object of unlimited covetousness. Men seeking power and authority, men seeking the title of vicar of Christ on earth, men who can seat and unseat kings, men who can judge all men but no man may judge him, was the ambition, the overarching ambition of the most ambitious men in the world at that time. It simply reduced the church from its emphasis on Christianity to an emphasis upon world conquest. And that's because it's not Christ's church in the first place. It serves the purpose of Antichrist in the earth. And just even a cursory look at its history makes this obvious. But R.W. Thompson goes far more than just a cursory examination of this papacy and Roman Catholic canon law and the Roman Catholic Church, and leaves absolutely no room for argument. Okay, he continues, he says, then the papacy sunk back into utter confusion and moral impotence. The Tuscan counts made it hereditary in their family. Again and again, dissolute boys like John the 12th and Benedict the 9th occupied and disgraced the apostolic throne, that is the papacy, which was now bought and sold like a piece of merchandise, and at last 3 popes fought for the tiara, until Emperor Henry III put an end to the scandal by elevating a German bishop to the See of Rome. So you see the covetousness, and we read yesterday also the corruption of these popes in the example given in the notes of John the 12th and of Benedict the 9th. Absolutely scandalous. Crimes that dare not even be uttered in this godless world. For example, John the 12th was accused of being incestuous with his own mother. And that's the degradation, the corruption, and the debasement and the debauchery that characterized the papacy during the rise of this so-called infallibility and the divine right to rule the world. You know, we're all familiar, as I've said before, we're all familiar with the quote, power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, what is being acquired by the papacy during this time is absolute power. And the result of it was absolute corruption. Yet, these popes are still regarded, many of them saints. And their example is to be given as the example for every succeeding pope. That they build upon this corruption and say that they cannot be accused, but that they were all the vicars of Christ, infallible, and should not be judged by any man. It still forms the basis of the papacy today. The papacy cannot divorce itself from its history. You know, you build upon a bad foundation, you're liable to wind up with a bad structure. And that's exactly what it is. Now, continuing where we left off yesterday, it says, the emperor, having by virtue of his temporal sovereignty over the empire, including Italy, obtained this recognized authority over the popes. They became, from necessity, more subject to the Teutonic than to the Frankish influences by which they had been directed from the time of the alliance of King Pepin and Charlemagne, of Emperor Pepin and Charlemagne. So we're seeing a power shift now from the French to the Teutonics. Okay, always the Franks or the French were the defenders of the papacy, and now in rebellion the power is shifted to the Teutonics, and they become the supporters. Now it says the Saxon and Salic emperors had by that time placed Germany in the very front rank of the nations. And although the German people were devoted from education and habit to the Roman Catholic religion, even then they gave occasional evidences that the natural love of freedom, which has since enabled them to reach a condition of superiority over the Latin races, and to assert principles which have become essential to all the advancing and progressive governments in the world. The emperors protected the popes of their own creation with strong hands, and but for this, it is almost certain that the Church of Rome would have been overwhelmed by Italian corruption and have sunk out of sight. So this was an unfortunate advantage to the papacy. It somewhat put a stop to the corruption, the growing corruption of the Italian papacy. This new power now rising, not originated from the French, but the German. Now, it says, after the Emperor Henry III had placed Leo IV, a German, in the pontifical chair in preference to an Italian, it became well understood by all the aspirants for that position that in whatsoever manner selected, no pope could be recognized as such without his consent. So now we're having the emperor seating the popes again, rather than the popes seating the emperors. And it says he swayed his temporal scepter over all parts of the empire, including the city of Rome. But this condition of affairs was submitted to by the Italians from necessity, not choice, and influences designed to counteract it were readily contrived. Among those most conspicuous in these counter movements was the celebrated Hildebrand, afterwards known as Pope Gregory VII, who employed all his acknowledged ability in the endeavor to persuade even the German popes that it was beneath their dignity to accept the papal tiara from a temporal prince. His ambition led him to abandon his cloistered life that he might put himself in a position ultimately to become pope. And by these means he hoped to lay the foundation of that system of measures out of which subsequently arose, under his skillful management, that vast pontifical power which he wielded with so much success over emperors, kings, and peoples. For more than a quarter of a century before he became pope, passing through the reigns of 8 popes, Hildebrand exercised a larger share of influence at Rome than any other man, not a pope, had ever done before. This commanding position was owing to his great courage, superior talents, and unbending will, all of which were employed to gratify his inordinate ambition. His leading and most cherished object was to overthrow the power of the emperors and establish the papal supremacy, not only at Rome, but elsewhere throughout the world. While Henry III lived, he practiced his intrigues with great caution. But at his death, when Henry IV became emperor at the age of 5 years, he took advantage of his minority and more openly and daringly avowed his purpose. Although the popes Leo IX, Victor II, Stephen IX, and Nicholas II had Alexander II all held their positions with the consent of these emperors, yet none of them was able to conduct the affairs of the church upon any other policy than that dictated by Hildebrand, before whom they were all dwarfed into comparative insignificance. So you can see that through the reigns of these popes just mentioned, it was Hildebrand who was running the show at the Vatican. And it says, when he himself became pope as Gregory VII, he had laid his plans so skillfully that while also compelled to obtain the assent of Henry IV to his pontifical ordination, he had very clearly marked out his way to ultimate success. He took his place at once in the very front rank of the leading men of his age. Like some giant oak which overshadows all the lesser trees of the forest, he rose to an immense height above all around him, and so impressed all Europe by the superiority of his intellect that it required centuries to get rid of the influence of his pontificate. No man in history has received more fulsome praise and more violent censure. And while this is not the place to inquire which of these he most deserved, it cannot be denied that among all his other qualities, none distinguished him so much as his ambition, his desire to make the papacy the governing and controlling power of the whole world in both spiritual and temporal affairs. In this aspect of his character alone, it is now proposed to view him. Gregory VII commenced his pontificate by asserting the right to dispose of kingdoms, and in imitation of the example set forth by Pope Gregory I nearly 400 years before. He granted to the Count of Champagne, in consideration of large sums of money, the right to conquer the kingdom of Aragon, and authorized him and other lords to seize upon the territory held by the Saracens and erect it into an independent kingdom subordinate to the papacy. He quarreled with Philip, King of France, and threatened him with anathema if he refused to obey him. He concerted measures to force all the bishops and the priests of the Roman Catholic Church to the practice of celibacy, so that, separated from all family and domestic influences, they might constitute a great army thoroughly and entirely devoted to the papacy. You see what the genesis of priestly celibacy was all about? To strip the priests of any worldly desire or any other commitment in their lives, but to be the defenders and the warrior monks of the papacy. And other researchers have come to the undeniable conclusion that it was to protect the pilferage of the property of the Roman Catholic Church as gifts to wives and children and concubines and bastards created by these priests. Okay? So they made it unlawful for them to marry. And they made the church their spouse. And they made the Pope the object of their endeavors, therefore strengthening the power of the Pope and eliminating one of his greatest enemies, his own priests. Now, it continues, it says, it roused up all the superstitious populations of Europe to undertake a holy war by marching to Palestine and wresting it from the hands of the infidel. Okay, here's the First Crusade. This is what happens when absolute power corrupts absolutely. He used that power to expand his intended global dominions by raising up a crusade to conquer the territory held by the infidel, the Saracens. And it says, and failed to execute this purpose only because he feared the power of the Emperor of Germany, who opposed it. He took from the King of France the power of investing bishops and excommunicated him for his resistance to his will. He directed the bishops of France to put the whole kingdom under interdict and to tell the king, if he persisted in his refusal to obey him, that, quote, the thunders of St. Peter will strike him as God before struck Satan, unquote. You see, this threat is based in religion and made the earth to tremble, made the kings of the earth to tremble. And it says he summoned Henry IV to appear before a council in Rome under penalty of anathema in case of disobedience. And when Henry threatened him in turn, he issued his bull of excommunication against him, not because of his want of devotion to the faith of the Roman Catholic Church, but on account of his differences upon the question merely temporal. In this celebrated bull, he appealed to the, quote, Holy Mother of God, St. Paul, and all the saints in heaven, unquote, to witness his sincerity, and then declared, quote, but since I have reached this throne by your grace, I believe that it is your will that Christian people should obey me by virtue of the power which you, St. Peter, have transmitted to me of binding and loosing in heaven and in earth. Thus, for the safety of the Church, and in the name of God all-powerful, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, I prohibit Henry, who by reason of unheard-of pride has elevated himself against us, from governing the kingdoms of Germany and Italy. I free all Christians from the oaths which they have taken to him, and I prohibit all from serving him as king. For he who would oppose our authority deserves to lose his crown, his liberty, and his life. I burden Henry then with anathema and malediction. I devote him to the execration of men, and I deliver up his soul to Satan, in order that the people may know that the sovereign pontiff is the rock upon which the Son of the living God has built his church, and that the gates of hell shall never prevail against it." Unquote. Have you ever heard a more ghastly quote in your life than this Pope who claims to be the vicar of Christ on the earth? And it says, "Gregory, far too bold for disguise, does not here pretend, as do many of the modern papists, that his right to interfere in the domestic affairs of Germany so far as to dethrone the emperor and release all his subjects from their allegiance to him was derived from the consent of the nations or from any human authority. He placed it upon the ground where the present Pope and all his hierarchy understand it to rest, that is, upon the power to bind and to loose, the power of the keys as delivered directly from God. In this sense, he regarded it as a power sufficiently great and omnipotent to absorb all other power upon the earth, by the possession of which, as the successor of Peter, he had the right to make and unmake kings, to construct and reconstruct governments, to wrestle from those who disobeyed him all the territory held by them, and to bestow it upon those who would hold it in subjection to his authority, and to do any and everything, no matter what, necessary to put the whole world under his feet. He had deliberately formed the purpose of creating an absolute and universal monarchy in the church, and a no less extensive and despotic civil monarchy which should overshadow all existing nations, and had the courage to declare that he was acting in obedience to the commands of God, who had given him, as his earthly vicar, full power over all mankind, so that he could open and close the gates of heaven or hell to them at his pleasure. He desired to bind all the people of every nation by a bond of allegiance to the Roman pontiffs, as the successors of Peter, so that all the contests in which nations or men should become involved should be settled at Rome, where the sole power of arbitration and decision should exist. And the ground upon which he rested this enormous claim of authority shows that he had no other idea in his mind than that it rightfully belonged to him as the head of the Roman Catholic Church. He placed his right to command Philip of France expressly upon the ground that both that country and the soul of the king, quote, were under the dominion of St. Peter, unquote, by virtue of his right, quote, to bind and to loose in heaven and upon the earth, unquote, well knowing as he did, that the popes were indebted for all their dignity and dominion to the French princes Pepin, Charlemagne, and their successors. The papacy knows where it originally got its temporal power, and that was by grant by treasonous kings Pepin and Charlemagne. That the papacy is built upon treason, fraud, forgeries, and lies. And yet it claims to be the vicar of Christ on earth. We'll continue right after these messages on Inquisition Update.
I pledge allegiance to the King of Kings, and to his kingdom come, on earth as it is in heaven. One holy nation, and our Heavenly Father, grace, mercy, justice for all.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Welcome back to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. Remember, we're heard Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. Central, 11 Eastern, on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. And if you wish to contact me, my contact information will soon be uploaded on the new website. It's tom@seawaves.us. That's tom@seawaves.us. Now, we're talking about this Antichrist, this pretender, this usurper of Christ's rightful throne, this Gregory VII, who assumes to make the earth his footstool. And it says he pretended that Saxony was held as a fief in subjection to the papacy because Charlemagne had given it as a pious offering to St. Peter. He maintained that Spain was the property of the Apostolic See, and that he had the right, by virtue of divine appointment, divine right, to exact homage of the Emperor of Germany and the kings of England, Hungary, Denmark, Poland, Russia, and all the powers and principalities of Europe, and to release their subjects from their allegiance in case of refusal, because they were all held in the same right. Therefore, when he found that there were many refractory bishops who were unwilling to be drawn away from their support of their own kings, he endeavored to incite them to disobedient revolt by such letters as the following, which he addressed to the Bishop of Metz. Listen to this. Quote, "As for those who maintain that kings cannot be legitimately deposed by popes, I refer them to the words of the example of the fathers, and they will learn that St. Peter said, quote, 'Be ye always ready to punish the guilty, whatever their rank,' unquote." I'd like to see that somewhere in the Bible. I just don't recognize it. Anyway, it continues, "Let them consider the motives which induced Pope Zachary to depose King Childeric, and to free all the Franks from their oath of fidelity. Let them learn that St. Gregory, in his decretals of 590 A.D. to 604 A.D., not only excommunicated the lords and the kings who opposed the execution of his orders, but that he even deprived them of their power. Let them not forget that St. Ambrose himself drove from the temple the Emperor Theodosius, calling him a profane man, sacrilegious, and a murderer. Perhaps these miserable slaves of kings would maintain that God, when he said to St. Peter, "Feed my lambs," accepted princes. In other words, excluded princes. But we will demonstrate that Christ, in giving to the apostle power to bind and to loose men, accepted no one. In other words, excluded no one. The Pope rules over everyone, okay? Not just princes, but the people as well. And he continues with a quote. He says, "The Holy See has absolute power over all spiritual things. Why should it not also rule temporal affairs? God reigns in the heavens. His vicar should reign over all the earth." The Pope's literally making the earth his footstool. This is blasphemy. And it says, "These senseless wretches," he continues, "however, maintain that the royal is above the episcopal dignity. Are they then ignorant that the name of king was invented by human pride and that the title of bishop was instituted by Christ?" St. Ambrose affirms that the episcopate is superior to royalty as gold is superior to a viler metal, unquote. Do you see the arrogant blasphemy of this Pope Gregory VII? Claiming to himself the right to seat and unseat kings as though he were Christ on earth. This is not a representative of Christ. This is a representative of Antichrist. And all of it driven by a covetousness of earthly ambition. Now here we have an example of the manner in which precedent may be made an apology for the most flagrant usurpation. Without pretense of authority for the construction he gave to the words of Christ when he conferred the power to bind and to loose upon the apostles, except that derived from the examples of Pope Gregory I and Zachary, the bold ambition of Gregory VII prompted him to declare that this was sufficient for his purpose. He reached this conclusion manifestly because he regarded all popes, both good and bad, as infallible and therefore incapable of error. In the same way, the whole system of papal supremacy is built up. One pope proving the existence of his enormous spiritual and temporal power by another. So they simply justify their claim to more and more and more spiritual and temporal power based on the precedent set by equally erroneous, blasphemous popes. The papacy answers to no one but itself. And they've set this precedent. One pope is a precedent to the next, which is a precedent to the next. It's a never-ending dynasty of blasphemy and usurpations. And it says, thus, after the pontificate of Gregory VII had ended, Alexander III added him to the list of examples, and then Innocent III added Alexander, and Boniface VIII added Innocent, and now in the 19th century, in the face of all this progress, when the list is brought down to Pope Pius IX, he invokes, in support of the doctrines of the Encyclical and Syllabus of Error of 1864, the examples of all his quote-unquote illustrious predecessors. Pope Gregory VII carried his interference in the affairs of Germany further than merely issuing papal bulls against Henry IV. He succeeded in stirring up revolt against him among the German nobles, who elevated Rudolf, Duke of Swabia, to the imperial throne in opposition to Henry. The Pope issued a decree in favor of Rudolph, again declaring Henry dispossessed of the crown, invoking upon his head the thunders of heaven, and declaring Rudolph, quote, the lawful king of the Teutonic states, unquote. Then addressing St. Peter and St. Paul, he says, quote, now, blessed St. Peter and St. Paul, let the world know by giving victory to Rudolph that you can bind and loose in heaven, that you can give or take away empires, kingdoms, principalities, duchies, marquisates, countships, and the goods of all men. Finally, that you take from the unworthy and bestow on the good the pontificate, primacies, archbishops, and bishoprics. Let the people know that you judge spiritual things and that you have an absolute power over temporal things, that you can curb the demons who are the counselors of princes and annihilate kings and the powerful of the earth. Display then your greatness and your power, and let the world now tremble before the redoubtable orders of your church. Cause especially the sword of your justice promptly to strike the head of the criminal Henry, in order that all Christians may learn that he has been stricken by your will, unquote. Calling down the powers of heaven upon this Henry, as though he had the power to do this. Now, it says, notwithstanding this solemn appeal to heaven, this impious invocation of the apostles in favor of his pontifical intrigues in Germany, the prayer of the Pope was not heard. The empire of Germany was not taken from its legitimate possessor, and the world did not tremble before the thunders of the Vatican. The pride of Henry, which had been sorely wounded by his former humiliation by Gregory, became excited, and the slumbering energies of the German people became aroused at this insolent attempt to place them at the feet of the papacy. Henry raised a large army and overthrew Rudolph, who lost his life in the battle, marched to Rome, convened a council of German ecclesiastics and nobles, deposed Pope Gregory VII, and placed the Metropolitan of Ravenna upon the pontifical throne under the name of Clement III. After many varying fortunes, Gregory was enabled to drive the antipope Clement from the throne, but he soon sunk under the tremendous load which pressed upon him, and in the year 1085 died, uttering these words, quote, no, my hatred is implacable. I curse the pretended Emperor Henry, the antipope Guibert, and the reprobates who sustain them. I absolve and bless the simple who believe that a pope has power to bind and to loose, unquote. Popes die hard, don't they? Claiming this right to rule the world. Are we to believe that this quality of the papacy, this covetous desire to rule the whole world, to put the whole world as his footstool, that somehow it is lost in history, that we live in more civilized times, and that the popes don't have this sort of arrogant desire? Are we to believe that? One thing can be sure. It's rarely talked about anymore. The book continues, it says, one other explanation by Gregory VII of the principles upon which he acted will enable the reader to form a just appreciation of his character and ambition. It is given by Cormenin the historian in these words, quote, God is a spirit, says Gregory. He rules matter. Thus the spiritual is above the temporal power. The Pope is the representative of God on earth. He should then govern the world. To him alone pertain infallibility and universality. All men are submitted to his laws, and he can only be judged by God. He ought to wear imperial ornaments. People and kings should kiss his feet. Christians are irrevocably submitted to his orders. They should murder their princes, fathers, and children if he commands it. No council can be declared universal without the orders of the Pope. No book can be received as canonical without his authority. Finally, no good or evil exists but in what he has commended, no good or evil exists but in what he has condemned or approved. Unquote. You can't take anything from this but that the Pope decides what is good and what is evil, and he may change his mind on a whim, and every man, woman, and child on the planet must use his definition of good and evil. Is this not God on earth? It says, thus understanding the principles of this great Pope, we are better enabled to press our inquiries one step further in order to understand the source of these principles and the method adopted by him to justify and to enforce them. And here again, the exhaustive work of Janus, the Pope and the Council, comes to our assistance. The author says this, quote, Gregory collected about him by degrees the right men for elaborating his system of church law. Anselm of Lucca, nephew of Pope Alexander II, compiled the most important and comprehensive work at his command between the years 1080 and 1086. Anselm may be called the founder of the new Gregorian system of church law. First, by extracting and putting into convenient working shape everything in the Isidorian forgeries serviceable for the papal absolutism. Next, by altering the law of the Church through a tissue of fresh inventions and interpolations in accordance with the requirements of his party and the standpoint of Gregory. Then came Deusdedit, whom Gregory made a cardinal, with some more inventions. At the same time, Bonizo compiled his work, the main object of which was to exalt the papal prerogatives. The 40 propositions or titles of this part of his work corresponded entirely to Gregory's Dictatus and the materials supplied by Anselm and Deusdedit. This same author then goes on to show how, by these old and new forgeries, all based upon the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, authority was found to justify every claim set up by the Pope, how the pretended decrees of the popes were put in place of canons and councils to supply all existing deficiencies, how they were made to justify the claim of Gregory of the right to give and to take away kingdoms at his pleasure, how the bishops were made gods so that no human tribunal could judge them, how even the lower clergy were made higher and more powerful than secular monarchs, and how Deusdedit, one of the forgers, falsely attributed to Boniface, the apostle of Germany, the abominable sentiment that, quote, even if a pope is so bad that he drags down whole nations to hell with him in troops, nobody can rebuke him, for he who judges all can be judged by no man. The only exception is in the case of his swerving from the faith, unquote. The main object of Gregory and of all these forgeries was to bring the church to the point of recognizing the doctrine of papal infallibility as absolutely necessary to salvation. They wanted to make papal infallibility a salvific issue. Where is that written in the Bible? Where is even the office of the papacy written in the Bible? You see, this is not a divine office. This is strictly a man-made office. It's time for the world to recognize it. To accomplish this, it was indispensable that the Pope should individually and personally absorb all the powers of the Church, so that his decrees should become the law for the government of all Christians, without the aid or consent of either general or provincial councils. In the earlier ages, general councils had always been assembled whenever it was necessary to settle questions of faith or discipline, and the canon law of the church was rightfully composed only of their enactments. Previous to the pontificate of Gregory, there were 8 of these councils. The Council of Nice in the year 325 condemned Arianism. The First of Constantinople in 381 condemned the heresy of Macedonius. The Council of Ephesus in 431 condemned the heresy of Nestorius. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 A.D. condemned the heresy of Eutyches. The Second of Constantinople, the Second Council of Constantinople in the year 553, acted upon the disagreements between the Eastern and Western Christians, and that had to do with idolatry, remember? And it said the Third Council of Constantinople in 682 condemned the Monophyllite heresy. The Second Council of Nice in 757 condemned the Iconoclast heresy. And the Fourth Council of Constantinople in 869 deposed the Patriarch Photius and restored Ignatius to his see. None of these councils would have been held or would have been necessary if the doctrine of papal infallibility had prevailed in the apostolic times or the centuries afterwards. So papal infallibility was not even recognized back then. How can the popes claim infallibility based on precedent when history clearly shows that the councils were the power of the church? And it says, but Gregory was not satisfied with this old order of things, with the principles which prevailed before the Church of Rome was contaminated by the influences of papal ambition. Like those secular despots who governed their nations by laws of their own creation without asking the assent of lords, nobles, or peoples, he resolved upon governing the church without the consent of bishops, clergy, or laymen. In other words, to put himself in the place of God as the sole dispenser of all spiritual and temporal authority. He loved absolutism because it gave him power, and he exercised power so as to make papal absolutism complete and universal. Therefore, he was the first pope who attempted the degradation of civil potentates, to the first who, quote, lifted the sacerdotal lance against the royal diadem, unquote. And it should excite no surprise when we find him appealing to, quote, to the first forged documents that came to hand as a solid proof, unquote, of the lawfulness of his usurpations, or that he set up the false pretense that Charlemagne had made all France and Saxony tributary to the Holy See, and declared that there were documents in proof of it preserved in the archives of St. Peter's. And remember, those documents have never been produced. Great as he was, he had that bad ambition which has so often left its blighted influence upon the world, and which prompts its possessors to justify the means by the end in view. You see, the papacy has always used the maxim, the end justifies the means. If they regard the end desired as good, then any means to achieve it is also good, even if they drag the whole church to the pit of hell in the process. He says, by the impious employment of sacred things to bring about mere temporal results, he left an example the influence of which has not yet died away at Rome. This author is telling us this is still the modus operandi of the papacy. This is still the goal of the papacy at the time of the writing of this book, 1876, 1874, somewhere in there. Are we to suppose that from the time of R.W. Thompson until now that somehow the papacy has reformed? Not on your life. And it says, and and if his pontificate may yet be justly referred to as one of exceeding brilliancy and splendor, and if he may be pointed out as one of the cherished saints of the Church, to be loved and imitated by the faithful, the true history assigns this position to him only because the world judges by results and not by details. If we look only at the luster which rested upon the brow of the pagan Caesar, we are dazzled by its splendor. Yet if we pause to inquire how he won the diadem, we almost hear the groans of the multitude of victims who were crushed beneath his heel. So if we search accurately the history of this papal Caesar, this Pope, we shall find him reaching his lofty eminence by trampling the most holy and sacred things under his feet, by giving way to the promptings of an unholy and unjust ambition, and by setting such an example as led to the corruption of subsequent popes and the demoralization of nearly the entire clergy. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That quote was made by Lord Acton, a liberal Roman Catholic, about the time of the the First Vatican Council, when it was considered and passed by the papacy that the Pope was infallible, and it was a matter of salvation that you accept that. Lord Acton, a Roman Catholic, said, in speaking of the papacy, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the papacy is absolutely corrupt. And it seeks to rule the whole world, just as today as it did in history. Now you know the power behind the power in Washington, D.C., and the rest of the governments of the world. Take heed. We're headed for a new world order, the simple restoration of the old. We'll see you tomorrow on Inquisition Update.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.